Thanks, Joanne. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. As Joanne said, this is a presentation about Office 365 and whether or not that's risk or reward, or perhaps both, to law firms. Lots of people are talking about Office 365 at the moment. Some people are jumping ship, some people are not. It depends on your attitude to risk and security in the cloud. And what I want to do today is talk a bit about some of those decisions, some of the things that might hold you back, and also some things to think about inside your organizations. You can follow us along on Twitter at Mimecast, or even follow me if you like at Orlando_SC. I'm a cybersecurity strategist here at Mimecast, and my job is about talking to organizations and people about our position on email security, cloud security, and generally cybersecurity. So, if you do have any questions, by the way, there's a Q&A tab or Q&A button on the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen there. I'll take some questions at the end if you'd like to submit them, and I'll do my best to answer those. If not, then I'll get back to you after the webinar's finished. So just to start, there's a bit of administration we have to go through first. You can't really talk about the cloud without having at least one slide of a cloud, and there it is. That's our techie cliche for the day. That's the cloud slide out of the way. This presentation isn't necessarily about the clouds. It's about what I think is the next almost revolution, if you like. I feel like we're on the edge of a technology revolution for business. We've been through the Industrial Revolution, we've been through the Internet Revolution, and although the cloud is not new, what it's giving us is the ability to have that productivity revolution inside of our organizations. Now, we do have to, before we really jump into talking about the cloud, tip our hat, or at least wave hello to the people we're leaving behind. And those are individuals that, in the interest of balanced reporting, we'll call server huggers. These are people who believe that the infrastructure should stay firmly wedded to the network. That's the only place it can be. That's the only place the data can sit, and that's the only place they retain control. I call them server huggers playfully, really. Finding a picture of someone hugging a server is quite hard to do, so there's a picture of a tree hugger, and we'll have to make do with those guys instead. But what I hope I do today, if you fall into that camp, or you're very dubious of the cloud, what I hope to convince you is that, yes, it's quite right to have questions about moving to the cloud, but hopefully I can give you some responses and also ways of thinking about those questions which are slightly different. Now, the bones of this presentation is about Office 365. It could easily be about Google Apps for Work. It could be about Amazon Workmail, Zoho, IBM. All of what I'll say can apply to really any type of cloud service. It doesn't have to be Office 365. But given that the majority of us in the legal industry are running Exchange on-premise, and most of us are considering Office 365 as an upgrade to that productivity suite at some point in the future, I'll apply this specifically to Office 365. Now, let's have a look at the numbers. Well, Exchange itself represents quite a good chunk of the worldwide business mailbox infrastructure. Radicata tell us that about a third of business mailboxes sit on Exchange server technology, 31% worldwide business mailboxes. The rest are scattered amongst a variety of other solutions, but of course people are migrating to Exchange all of the time as well, and that increases the number. Radicata also tell us the adoption of cloud messaging, that 43% of worldwide business mailboxes will be in the cloud by 2018, which is not hugely far away. Exchange, we know that Exchange Server 2013 is the most deployed version, accounting for about 55% of total Exchange deployment. So, on the whole, everyone's pretty well up to date. 2016 is just around the corner, but 2013 is the most modern that you can get right now. The interesting thing about moving to 2013 or even 2016 is that by the time that functionality becomes part of an on-premise Exchange infrastructure, it's already been rolled out and tested in an Office 365 environment for some time. And Redmond in particular take Office 365 as being the primary platform. Certainly the Exchange teams that we talk to classify Exchange on-premise as taking a smaller seat to Office 365. So there's a lot of evidence to show that there's a move to the cloud. It's happening. We know it's happening. We talk to law firms of various sizes all of the time. Everybody mentions Office 365 in that conversation, but they all have a different position on where they would like to be in that process. Now, to quote Gartner in their characteristically brief style, they say that they have a strategic planning assumption that the proportion of business users provisioned in whole or in part with Office capabilities in the cloud will grow from around about 15% last year to 60%, or approximately 700 million users in 2022. I think we're slightly ahead of that. I think we're slightly ahead of that curve, and more and more people are beginning to move to Office 365. It's gaining more and more momentum because Microsoft are making it better and better, and they're closing a lot of the objections down that people had. And in fact, last year, I believe it was, at their Ignite conference, they said that 35% of all of their Exchange install base is now on Office 365. So there's no denying that there's growth here. There's growth in moving your productivity suites to the cloud, and all of this points, as I said at the beginning, to a productivity revolution. Now, what drives that revolution? Well, the advantages of the cloud are obvious. We know a lot of these already. Whenever we talk to members of the legal industry, they tell us that the cost savings are obvious to organizations, but what the cloud is giving you is the ability, if I could sum it up in one sentence, is to say that it gives you the ability to be ahead of your competition. It makes you more agile, and it gives your business better and even newer functionality. So Office 2016, for example, the versions of Office 2016 and Exchange 2016 that are supported by Office 365 leave the older on-premise versions of Exchange and Office really for dust. So at the very least, upgrading to the latest technology means you can be more agile and more competitive in tougher markets, and you can respond faster to things. There are a couple of advantages we should look at in a bit more detail. These are ones that are well tested as well, so I haven't just made these up, which is so there's a lot of information, a lot of calculations that cloud businesses have done to be able to help you understand these. The first advantage is, as I mentioned, always cost. The cost of on-premise services is getting harder to justify, and many law firms we talk to have a cloud-first policy where if they roll out a new service, they always examine the possibility of using a cloud platform for that before they then look at provisioning their own infrastructure on-premise. And that's true when it comes to new services or upgrading services that are already in situ. And that's driven, I think, because the IT team are so overworked with less budget, less people. They're almost paying to go and ask for more money from the finance team and the senior partners. IT budgets are being squeezed anyway, and the cost savings in cloud have become an obvious policy and one to go for. At the same time, the poor old IT team are dealing with a lot of the complexity that has been built up over the past 20, maybe 30 years worth of running our own infrastructure on-premise in-house. This is wearing us down, and it's beginning to become a problem. So law firms are struggling to find ways to wade through that tangle of technology that exists in the average server room. Most of it we know is one or two versions past. So your Exchange, again, is a good example. Although 2013 is the most popular version, there are still people on 2010 or 2007 and even 2003, which is what ours supports. And 2016 is just around the corner, but a lot of us have only just got to 2013. So we're a couple of versions back. I like to always use a little test here, the reincarnation test, or the if we had our time again as IT manager test. If we had a blank network diagram, a completely empty Visio page, what would we draw? And I'd argue and probably bet my last fiver that we'd all go for a cloud service every time where possible, because it removes a lot of that on-premise complexity and cost. And then, of course, I mentioned earlier also that innovation and access to new features is important as well. Keeping the server infrastructure on the LAN means you rely on a 3 or perhaps 5-year upgrade cycle. That seems a little bit 1990s, sort of early turn of the century technology these days. Only recently, I suppose only recently, Microsoft have moved to a cumulative updates or an update roll-up model for key infrastructure like Exchange. So it's hardly surprising that we've come from that legacy. But what it means is you're not getting the benefits of the latest technology today. And when we look at that technology, it's almost as though the 90s will phone us up and say we want our network diagram back, because as I said in the last slide, if we had our time again, we wouldn't build that same infrastructure. We want the latest features, we want the latest tools, we want to excite our end users with the latest interfaces and give them the ability to have unified communications and all of the best tools we can. We do this in our personal lives, if you think about it. So when you buy something like a tablet or a smartphone, we're fastidious about those upgrades. We're absolutely fastidious about it. And we always research our own domestic purchases until we know exactly what we're buying, what the best version is. A lot of us use the adage of buy once, buy well. But we don't necessarily do this in our business tech because we have that legacy to deal with. It's not easy either. That's the problem. But of course, this is where the cloud does help us, and why so many people are turning to Office 365 as a mechanism to cut those tethers to the network. Now, I suppose it's time now to introduce a bit of risk, just to bring us back down to earth. There is, of course, risk associated with the cloud. A lot of organizations I spoke to, law firms I speak to, love the idea, but just aren't prepared to accept that risk in their organizations yet. And what I want to introduce to you now is the idea that we're almost sleepwalking into a SaaS monoculture, if you like, a cloud monoculture. We're moving from a software ecosystem where we've got a variety of different pieces of technology into a single platform. So before we examine those risks, let me explain a bit more about what I mean by a SaaS monoculture. Well, in short, what I'm proposing is that there's danger in a single cloud vendor. In an ecosystem, if you think about it, you've got many environments, many code bases, many locks to pick, and cyber criminals and hackers are going from one entity at a time, and they're targeting one organization at a time. In a single cloud vendor environment like Office 365 or Google for Work, there's one environment running on one code base, and that effectively is one lock to pick. And it could, if the vulnerability is bad enough, lead the attackers to have access to all of the tenants at once, which would be pretty dramatic. Now, there are three types of risk and SaaS monoculture here that exist. The first is the data monoculture. In a software ecosystem where you have comprehensive risk management around your data management, you've got many environments. There's independent recovery on all of those environments usually. Those are supported by offsite backup. Generally, there's a low risk of data loss, and we can recover systems individually as and when we need to. In an Office 365 world, a single cloud world, quite rightly, what you have with any reputable cloud vendor is a strong, replicated live environment, and you should always make sure that exists, that the data is replicated in many different places at once. But certainly for Office 365, it lacks independent verification and recovery. And remember, we're running on a single environment here, a single code base. There is no independent recovery. The risk of data loss could be higher, and I'll cover some scenarios later on where I can show you exactly where that risk comes from. Before that, we'll talk about the second type of monoculture, which I think is a security monoculture. And again, in an ecosystem, if you think about your environment now, quite rightly, it would be fair to say that we're lots of small and uninteresting targets with a relatively small attack surface. Unless somebody comes after our law firm specifically, we're just fending off the barrage of noise and junk and rubbish that's out there on the internet that comes at us on a daily basis. Microsoft software is constantly under attack anyway, as is Cisco, as are all of the market leaders. It's unfair to pick on any one vendor, but the biggest vendors are always under attack. And that's largely because of their dominance in the market. But when you're managing your own infrastructure, your own system, you can have control over that. Move to the cloud, on the other hand, and you're moving into the eye of that storm. So Office 365 in particular is constantly under attack. All cloud vendors are constantly under attack because of their dominance in the cloud market and the business services and the business customers they have. You become effectively part of a larger target with many interesting tenants, and the attack surface is significantly larger. And again, I'll come on to how to deal with that one slightly later on as well. And then lastly, the third type of monoculture is availability. And this is usually a big one for people thinking about moving to a cloud solution. In your diverse ecosystem that you would have on-premise, you have multiple environments again. You have different mitigation options for outages and service-related incidents. Also, your supply chain is largely unaffected if there's some kind of problem, or your supply chain is affected, then you can find an alternative supplier for something. We're able effectively to manage and control our own availability to some extent. I mean, if we have a catastrophic outage, it's a different question. But in a SaaS monoculture, in a service like Office 365, you're effectively putting all of your eggs into a single basket. And that's the same basket as everybody else's eggs as well. So the supply chain could also be in that basket. The supply chain could use Office 365. You could be offline when they're offline. And as a smaller organization is generally fine, thousands of businesses trying to return their service to normal at once means long hold queues. It means frustration. And where do you rank in that queue amongst all of the other businesses? The hold queue is longer than perhaps you're used to. Now, here's the interesting thing. If I were to suggest that we do this on-premise, we were to have a monoculture on-premise, you'd probably kick me out or put the phone down. If I'd have walked into any business meeting a few years ago and said, all of this infrastructure you have, all of the security technology you have from different vendors, let's get rid of that and let's buy it all from one vendor, because why not? You'd think I'm mad. And has anyone ever done that? I would argue they probably haven't, because we've always had that belt and braces approach. We've always had different telecoms providers on different lines from different locations, different power providers. We've had different security solutions on the desktop that we had at the gateway. But what's happening right now is that SaaS monoculture is flattening all of that technology into a single layer. And that's the risk. It's a complex machine. Undoubtedly, Office 365 is like a jet engine of modern computing, if you like. It can't be infallible, and it would be unrealistic to expect it to be so. So we have to accept some risk. And when we've identified those three risks, then you can work inside your organizations to find a way to really mitigate them. Now, remember, by comparison, we've done this on the network. On the LAN, we surrounded Exchange 2013 or any Exchange version or our mail server with many layers of technology, many layers of protection. And we did that because we would never have just plugged Exchange into the internet and hope for the best. We used to do that 20 years ago. And then, of course, all of the problems that currently exist and all of our compliance issues and all of our requirements for extra business services effectively surrounded our mail server with a variety of different point solutions. In the cloud, though, you're effectively being asked to have a single layer of protection, a single layer of technology, whether that's Office 365 or Google. It's a single layer. And that's where the risk lies, I think. That's the problem. So I gave you three types of monoculture. I'm going to give you three types of risk as well with the flattening of that technology. The first risk, of course, is flattening security. You're flattening all of those layers of security that you've built up in the network, or even through a variety of cloud providers and hybrid infrastructure and on-premise infrastructure over the years into a single vendor. And a single vendor security option is hard to justify. That kind of strategy. We can't simply flatten all of those layers into one. And new threats come and go. Attacks on one tenant, perhaps in the cloud, could exploit everybody. And also what you have to remember is the roadmap for security has to be absolutely top-notch to accept that flattening into a single vendor. The second risk, of course, is that there's no offsite. You lose the independent discovery, review, recovery options. All of those things don't exist. And remember, what we do now with our backups is we generally take them off site, we make sure they're rotated, and we test them, we make sure we can get data back. But in the cloud, there are many different ways to lose data that you may not have considered. Data loss through misconfiguration of retention rules is sadly a realistic case, and has happened a couple of times already in Office 365. The inability to independently locate or verify the completeness of your data does also worry some customers. Technological failures, bugs, that can cause data loss. Authorized or unauthorized access with malicious intent can cause data loss. And the inability to restore parts or point-in-time data back into Office 365 by any other means rather than using the Office 365 data itself is pretty tricky. And as an IT department, you're probably very often asked by a senior partner, I deleted an email last year that I want it back. And if you're in a cloud environment without a secondary repository of email, that's very, very hard to do. And then, of course, the third risk is the downtime risk. Downtime delays, brownouts, internet problems, we can call it all sorts of different things, but any problem with an element of the service that can cause downtime for one tenant could cause downtime for lots of tenants in a cloud environment. A regional outage could be due to technical issues, and that could affect everybody. And remember, it can also affect the supply chain as well. And this is not just Office 365. This could be Amazon, it could be Google. Remember, one of Google's data centers got hit by lightning 4 times, which no one ever would have bet on. So we don't have to pick on any one provider, but also it can happen on premise in your own environments as well. But it's not as well known about or published because we don't. If it happens, we just restore service and we don't generally tell anyone unless it's a big outage. Now, Microsoft do a lot here to help mitigate that threat. So, quite rightly, in their SLA, they say there are factors outside of their control, and it would be unreasonable of us to not accept that. All cloud vendors have to be pragmatic here at some point. In the same way you're pragmatic about your on-premise services, being able to keep those up and running constantly. It would be naive of any of us to say we can keep any system up and running 100% of the time without there being some sort of impact. But when you bring 2 systems together, particularly 2 cloud systems, you get a lot closer to being able to offer that zero downtime solution because you have failover between the 2. And I'll come back to that in a second. Now, the end game really right now, if you're thinking about Office 365 or Google or any cloud productivity suite, is really cloud plus risk. That's the way I'd put it. So moving to Office 365 or Google for Work is right for the business, but on their own, each of those services represents a greater exposure to risk than perhaps you're necessary. Office 365 and cloud productivity requires really the acceptance of that risk, but it shouldn't. That's the moral of this story, and I've got a good case study to help highlight that as well. It's a unique case study, and it highlights the risk and reward of a single cloud solution. If you think about government adoption of cloud services like Office 365, there's a very real possibility that problems affecting Office for 365 or Google for Work could bring down the daily function of the country as a whole. As central and local government adopt those cloud services, the impact of these 3 risks I've just run you through increase. We know already the Houses of Parliament are running Office 365. They had a significant outage a couple of years ago. The Cabinet Office running Google Apps had a similar outage. Downtime itself within the Houses of Parliament was 13 hours due to a configuration issue. So I guess what we have to wonder is, could the government adoption of these cloud platforms or other cloud solutions have an impact on the running of the state, of central or local governments? It's not just about central government, it's about local governments as well. There are quite a few local governments that have adopted Office 365, and what that then does is broaden the attack surface for this particular case study as well. State infrastructure runs on the cloud in more places, and it broadens the impact of any issue. For example, Norfolk County Council are running Office 365, as are Wiltshire Council, Glasgow City Council, Dudley Metropolitan Borough Council. All of those organisations could be affected by the same type of outage the government, central government could be affected by. And then when you add on top of that the supply chain as well, when everyone runs on the same platform and the platform becomes the target, the entire system becomes at risk. And we lose the isolation and environmental redundancy built into any government ecosystem, just like we lose it built into our own local ecosystems. Remember, everyone's running on a single code base, and there's no independence of recovery within that code base. So I'd argue that perhaps what we should be thinking about is, as we adopt these cloud services, we think about them as critical national infrastructure. And certainly we know that email in our organizations, in law firms and businesses, is a critical tool. It's probably one of the top 3 tools in the business. Surely the same must be true for government if they're offline for any period of time. The benefit, of course, is when everything's in the cloud, you can't leave data on a train or in a briefcase in a taxi or a restaurant. The other good point that I should mention here is that Microsoft in particular are no slouch when it comes to making sure that they are responding to the government's need for service and availability. They're being very proactive here. They're conforming already to the government's 14-point cloud security principles, and were the first to meet the ISO 27018 standard, which Mimecast has also met recently, and that's the code of practice for protection of personally identifiable information in public clouds, acting as a PII processor, which rolls off the tongue. And if you think it's a bit dramatic to talk about critical national infrastructure, if you think about the definition of CNI, not everything is critical, but there are certain critical elements of infrastructure. And the definition says that the loss of, compromise, or which would have a major detrimental impact on the availability or integrity of essential services, leading to severe economic consequences. Or, okay, maybe it's a stretch, but as more and more central organizations adopt single vendor solutions, then that becomes more of a reality. So let's go back to those risks. How do we manage them? How do you go back to your partners and your law firms and say, well, I've found a way to manage some of these risks that we're worried about with Office 365. Remember the security. Remember we were flattening the layers of technology that we built up over time just to get us to the cloud. Defense in depth becomes effectively a single vendor with a very thin layer. Remember that single lock to pick, that kind of analogy I used when it comes to a cloud service. So what you need to find is a way to put that defense in depth back. There's a danger when you talk about defense in depth as a security guy that people think, well, that's a dead strategy because our perimeter is gone, our network is dirty, everything is ruined. We don't have that classic perimeter that we used to before, but we can apply this to email security in particular in the cloud, because you can still put 2 cloud services together to bolster the security that one on its own would have. So you need to replace the solutions that provide you those layers of protection that you have on premise. And that gives you, if you like, defense in depth for a cloud age, the ability to add a security overlay to a service like Office 365, reinstates that defense in depth that you're leaving behind on the network. And you've replaced really what's a wider attack surface protected by a single lock to pick with more layers. You've added layers of technology, a different product roadmap, a more advanced security. And that applies especially for Exchange Online Protection and Google for Work. Very few of us would have relied solely on those services without the additional protection of some sort of gateway on the LAN. And EOP is not new, it's been around for a long time, and very few of us would have used that on its own. The second risk that we spoke about was there being no offsite. There's no backup for that data. There's no way to regain that data. If Microsoft or Google is the new on-site, where is the new off-site? Your data really is only as safe as Microsoft or Google make it. It's not verifiable. It's not in a system really designed for long-term retention as an archive. And there's kind of no archive for assurance or backup or e-discovery unless you put your entire organization on legal hold, which some people will do, but most won't. So again, when it comes to archiving and retention and backup of that data, look for data assurance, if you like, in the clouds. You add a second layer. You're adding an archiving or backup overlay onto Office 365, providing long-term retention for all of your users, even the ones that have left. And of course, that supports e-discovery, it supports backup, it supports verification of data in Office 365 or Google. And you have effectively a dedicated cloud backup and archiving layer that's independent of your core cloud productivity suite. We're not alone when we say that. Gartner in 2015, Prushan Rinnan and Dave Russell also said the same thing. They said, in fact, they wrote a white paper saying you may need additional backup to prevent data loss from your SaaS solutions, and that was January 2015 they wrote that, which is a very good read if you're a Gartner customer. And then, of course, the third risk we spoke about was downtime as well. So downtime does happen. Outages happen in the cloud, on-premise, everywhere. There's no getting away from that. And if Office 365 or even Google has got you, who's got them? Who supports those guys? Downtime, delays, brownouts, internet problems, they're all inevitable in the cloud and on-premise, but it will be naive to expect to get away unscathed here. And remember, it's not just about Office 365. It could be Amazon Web Services, Google for Work. It could be everybody. So we want to find a way to mitigate that risk by providing cloud availability, continuity in the cloud. Always on is hard and expensive and time-consuming to do on the network. But there are ways that you can come close to it. But in the cloud, it becomes a lot easier. If you think about a dual cloud solution to that problem, if one goes down, the other one steps in, and vice versa. So I suppose it would always be unrealistic to rely on a strategy of hope, if you like. What we know is that hope is not a strategy. There have even been books written about that. But all of these changes bring a larger risk to our organization, and they get bigger as Office 365 becomes more successful. So you have to, I suppose, ask yourself and your organization, what's your strategy for mitigating risk in Office 365? Is it risk or reward, or is it both? What we know is that it had better not be hope, because, ladies and gentlemen, we know that hope being a strategy doesn't work. You might be part of the hope club, if you like. If you're thinking about hoping that risk mitigation is Office 365 or Microsoft or Google, you're hoping it's their responsibility, and you're waiting to see if there's going to be a problem, and you'll act after there's been a problem. You're hoping that Plan A is enough, and that only Plan A exists. And perhaps also you're hoping that with no risk mitigation budget for the cloud, you'll be fine. Perhaps you also hope that best practice in the cloud is different to best practice on site, and you hope that although some of your peers, other law firms may have risk mitigation, perhaps you don't need it, because nothing ever happens around here. We don't need to plan in advance. And also, you're hoping that when Microsoft or Google say, "Yeah, you'll be fine. You don't need anything else," you're hoping that actually that is true. But it would be far better, I think, and one of my key points today is that it will be far better to be part of that plan club. So rather than rely on hope, start to plan for the future. And if you're planning for the future, you know that Office 365 or cloud risk mitigation is assumed to be the responsibility of each and every tenant on that platform. You're predicting failure and you're acting before that incident. You don't just rely on Plan A, you have a Plan B, maybe even a Plan C, and you test those plans all of the time, which means you also have a modest mitigation budget as well when it comes to risk mitigation. And what you're able to do is map best practice in the cloud to the best practice you're using on site, so you don't lose anything in the translation there. And you realize that your peers in the legal industry may have some mitigation, or they may not, but you know you have. Therefore, they're going to be at a disadvantage. And you also realize that Microsoft could never be impartial about mitigating the risk themselves. So they always tell you that they'll do a great job, and believe they will most of the time. But you've always got to have that Plan B. Relying on Plan A just really isn't enough. So really, to summarize the presentation today, to give you your moment of enlightenment, the things that you can go away and take back to your organization, what I'd like you to leave with are these thoughts: that risk managing your cloud infrastructure is entirely possible. Whether it's Office 365 or Google, IBM, Zoho, even Mimecast, don't assume you'll be okay in the cloud. Work to manage those risks. Work to put together a portfolio of cloud vendors that can support productivity, the main productivity services in the organization, but also provide continuity backup and archiving. Don't rely on a single cloud vendor. A single cloud vendor for productivity services is not really enough. You need at least 2 cloud vendors to fully risk manage things like Office 365 and Google. You need layers of protection, if you like: security, backup, archiving, continuity. All of those layers are needed for this to really work. And you need to mitigate those 3 risks that I've mentioned. And really, as a final thought, what I think we might see in the years to come, as cloud infrastructure becomes part of a system for government, it may well become critical national infrastructure, and perhaps we'll see legislation that requires public bodies to risk manage the single vendor strategies for cloud that they have, to ensure that they use a multi-cloud strategy instead, to make sure that they're unaffected by problems and issues in the cloud. So hopefully I haven't worried you too much. Hopefully I've given you some food for thought to go back to your partners with, your law firms, and to find a way of having a conversation about Office 365 with it, which actually removes some of those classic hurdles and barriers. It shouldn't be about security or availability or data access. All of those problems are easily dealt with today. It should be about being able to get your organizations into the cloud and make you more agile and more competitive. And get onto a more modern infrastructure as you go. Ticket can help you with that, certainly, as can Mimecast. Feel free to talk to your account managers about that if you like.